Thank you for tuning in to an episode of InRange. This is the June 2020 Q&A. All these questions provided by Patreon supporters. And this month we're specifically talking about the KP15 polymer lower and the What Would Stoner Do 2020 project. That's why we've got Ian here and Russell Fagan, all three of us, of course, combined in this project together to answer your really interesting questions. So we'll get started.
So first off, if you're not aware of this, head over to brownells.com, check it out. We've got all of our current videos up to date on the What Would Stoner Do 2020. You can also pre-order the rifle over there. No down payment. We're not big on pre-orders with that.
No.
How could that possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
No down payments, but orders that are placed there tell Brownells how much interest there is. And that translates into orders for Mr. Fagan here with KE Arms, because KE is the company that is doing the actual development and manufacturing of the KP15 lower, which is the heart and soul of the What Would Stoner Do 2020.
And you can pre-order just the lower, or you can pre-order an entire What Would Stoner Do 2020 complete rifle carbine, which is awesome.
Will make you 10% sexier.
Yeah. Oh,
it's a scientific fact.
Yeah. When we built that thing, I had no idea it was going to be as rad as it turned out to be.
Indeed.
I mean, it really was a surprise to both of us. We're like, whoa, this was far more than I expected. Lots of questions. Let's get going. Kyle G, any updates on a tentative ship date? Now, where are we at?
If everything goes according to plan, we'll begin shipping at some point in July. The cores and cavities are currently being cut. We'll be doing a round of initial testing, running the mold, and making sure everything is where it needs to be and that the parts are molding correctly. Make any adjustments we need to, test weld the parts, and then move into full production.
Now, if I understand the firearms industry, what you do is you're going to make like 20 initial alpha prototypes, and you're going to send them to the first 20 people that ordered, and not tell them anything, and then wait for the angry complaints, and then see what you need to fix. Is that... That's how the gun industry works, right?
No, that's not the goal?
No, definitely not the goal. So we want to make sure everything is 100% good to go before we release them for sale.
Okay.
So part of that process is the fire control pinholes, the takedown pinholes, and a couple other features are not actually located in the mold yet until we do a test run to calculate shrink rate.
Exact shrink rate.
And that's not even really that far behind the original destination date.
Yeah, we'd always said end of Q2 since SHOT Show, and we're really not far off from that. COVID did affect some of our subcontractors on this. The
jerks had the nerve to go make medical stuff.
Right. So a little bit of a delay there, not substantial. So I'm kind of taking it on a week-by-week basis, but I'm seeing progress on the mold weekly, and in the very near future we'll be running test parts, and we'll have more content as we're going through the testing phases of the initial runs of the receivers and onto production.
That is notwithstanding the upcoming Ebola airborne plague and Teutonic plate fracturing that may occur later in 2020.
Teutonic plate fracturing?
Tectonic.
We're going back to East and
Yeah,
West.
we're going back. Yeah, no. But who knows? The point is that's the goal unless something else crazy happens in this year.
Which inevitably will. Pistolsmith says, will there be an unfinished non-firearm, aka 80%, version of the KP15 lower?
Yeah, I want my take and bake. I want to put it in the oven at 350 and then have an AR-15 fall out.
Simple answer is it is incredibly unlikely. Based on previous rulings related to polymer receivers from the ATF, if there's anything along the fire control group that constitutes a seam, it is beyond 80%. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but we also know that currently ATF is overwhelmed with a number of things, and they are under political pressure to either not approve or not issue rulings on new 80% concepts because ghost guns have been in the news too much. So it could potentially happen, but it would require new cores and cavities, significant financial investment, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then possibly tens of thousands of dollars to pursue the legal ruling on getting it approved.
Unfortunately, with a molded polymer lower like this, you can't stop at like 80% of the mold process and have an 80% product. It just doesn't physically work that way, like it does with a CNC machine part.
You would need an entirely different mold, and even then you have the problem with the seam you're talking about, because these are cast essentially, or molded into two halves that are then put together.
Right.
So maybe you could do it in Somalia, but that's not here. M193 GoofBall. What kind of butt plate will the lowers come with, and are there any plans to release any other butt plates with different thicknesses, pitch angle, materials, etc., to allow for some degree of customization?
So to be clear, it is capable of accepting any A1 or A2 butt plate. or anything that is meant to attach to an A1 or A2 butt stock. So those are options. The butt plate that it ships with may be injection molded, or it might be a simple machined aluminum butt plate without a trapdoor compartment. We're trying to keep the cost per unit of the strip lower down to $100 MSRP, and offering too many features and too many options with that is going to drive up the cost. So as is, it'll have a very simple butt plate, but you have the ability to buy any number of other butt plates that are on the market for A1 and A2 stocks to attach to it, including things like the SPR butt plate that gives you an adjustable length of pole and cant and that kind of stuff.
And there's a hollow core inside the butt stock there, so if I put a trapdoor butt plate on it, I can open up the trapdoor and actually have a usable cavity.
There's a compartment, there just isn't the door.
And worst case scenario, like if you want to just do it simple, you could always have an Allen wrench to open up the solid butt plate to get at the storage compartment in there.
Fair enough.
Molly says, will the KP15 include compatibility for some form of ambi bolt release by default, or is that feature machined in later and only available on the What Would Stoner Do 2020 complete rifles?
The feature for the PDQ lever is machined in after the fact. Mass marketability for the lower is what makes it economically viable. As much as we want to sell tens of thousands of complete What Would Stoner Do rifles, incorporating that PDQ lever feature into every lower would leave a void if someone was using a standard bolt catch, and PDQ levers are proprietary, patented, relatively expensive, and always in short supply. So we don't want to discourage the sales of individual lowers because of the availability and expense of that part. But it will be included with every complete What Would Stoner Do rifle.
Sean S. followed up with a question very similar, and if he wanted to use his mad Dremel skills to alter a standalone KP15 lower, you could do that.
You could do that. Be advised you may void the warranty depending on how aggressive you get with your dremeling. But it is possible for the end user to do that, and it's probably easier for the end user to do that in a polymer lower than it would be in an aluminum lower.
Significantly lower. Now, what if they go a little crazy with their Dremel skills and cut the thing in half?
We haven't finalized our warranty plan for these yet, but we will very likely have a reduced cost replacement option for people who completely destroy their lower through misuse, neglect, or aggressive dremeling.
Lower risk if you measure once and cut thrice.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Walter Hole, H. Are there any plans to make inserts for the storage area along the lines of a Magpul pistol grip insert? Batteries, spare parts, cleaning kits, cigar, humidors, etc. So that would be something in this chapter compartment.
Molded, I don't think is likely because the mass marketability of that insert would be relative to this receiver only. It wouldn't necessarily be compatible with an A1 or A2 stock because they all have different internal geometries. What I do think would make sense for there would be a sewn product, some sort of sewn bag for a cleaning kit, or maybe a sewn placard with the loops for batteries on it, something like that. But I don't think molding a internal compartment for that would be immediately viable, not until we're getting into the hundreds of thousands of parts in circulation realm.
You know, it'd be a really good substitute. 3D printing something.
This is perfect for 3D printing.
Yeah.
If you wanted to make a 3D printed battery storage thingy that goes into this, that would be, and our audience is the right audience for that kind of thing. So go wild, 3D print all sorts of neat stuff. I think that'd be a perfect solution.
Daniel says, was a buffer retaining pin even bothered with? Because we left the buffer pin out on the What Would Stoner Do 2017.
Yeah, we should add to that. We went with the JP Complete Capture Spring system because it was actually found it to be a much better solution that you could just take it out as one unit. You didn't have to worry about losing a spring and a buffer. As well as, I know this always causes consternation, those buffer pins, traditional buffer pins, they do break and they do fall into the fire control group. So we left them out. But what about this?
Again, going back to mass marketability of the receiver, it does have a provision for a buffer detent, where a traditional buffer detent would be held in by the buffer tube, the front lip of it. In this case, the buffer detent's held in place by a 5/64 roll pin. And personally, even if I'm not using a JP silent capture spring system, I omit the buffer detents on my rifles for a number of reasons, so you could just simply not install it if you don't want it there.
If you're a buffer pin loyalist, no problem. You can put one in the KP15. I would recommend, however, if you do that, to look at the HK improved buffer pin because it is not going to break like a traditional one. Aaron H., whenever you mention the polymer lower you went with, there will often be mention of AR-15 lowers converted to polymer. What does this mean, and what's the difference between those and yours?
So taking like in a literal aluminum forged lower dimensionally and then making out of plastic isn't going to work. The top of the threaded area where the buffer tube comes in is a fail point, and the rear takedown pinhole is also a fail point because of the forces exerted by the bolt carrier and the buffer bottoming out, putting leverage on it and making those areas effectively flex downward force-wise under recoil. So because the buttstock, buffer tube, pistol grip, and trigger guard are all part of the receiver, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Where if you tried to do an aluminum lower dimensions and polymer, it's just not going to work. We've seen that fail so many times over the past 2 decades with any number of polymer receivers on the market. Inserts are not, specialized buffer tubes are not. Anything people have come up with, it's always been kind of a workaround, and they create a weaker part while also not gaining the benefits of polymer. So this is the single most effective way to produce a polymer receiver for the AR-15.
So it's weird because that's the thing, is like a lot of people got a bad taste in their mouth from old school people, like some of the polymer lowers on the market where they just took an AR-15 aluminum part and made it in polymer. And you have to redesign what you're trying to do based on the material you're building it out of. And those are junk, quite honestly. And this is built to be polymer, and that's the big difference.
David wants to know, are there any plans for a variant that would allow for the grip to be changed out so individuals could customize the grip angle to their preferences?
No, we have no plans to make different grip-capable lowers currently. Again, mass marketability, keeping the cost low, molding that grip in, increases production speed, increases durability, and reduces cost. For a similar grip on the market, if you're buying it separately, you're going to spend, what, $20 to $25?
At the lowest.
Right?
Some of those things are quite expensive.
So molding that grip in that's going to meet that middle 80% of customers, or the bottom 10% may not like it, the top 10% may not like it, but everyone in the middle will be happy and find it to be a comfortable and adequate grip, is the way to go.
I can do some dremeling on that if I want, right? I can like reduce the palm swell or cut finger grooves or something.
We'll get to that later. There's a question about that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oops.
Rumble strip. Which buffer system is this set up for, rifle or carbine, and can I run an A5 system? A5 is a proprietary Veltor thing.
So it is set up for carbine because the back end of the stock here is all reinforcement ribbing to absorb the impact of the buffer. We did not even consider A5 buffers as part of the design because it is a proprietary part that's always in short supply, and they're relatively expensive versus carbine buffers. So again, what makes this project viable is that we're going to potentially sell tens to hundreds of thousands of this receiver to spread out the cost of all the R&D, all the tooling costs, the cost for the welder. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop and produce this part. So those costs have to be spread out over a large number of parts to make it economically viable. And doing something that uses a proprietary part that's in lower supply with a increased cost versus commonly available carbine buffers would discourage people from purchasing the receiver by itself to build their own firearms to their own specifications and requirements.
When we did the What Was Done to Do project, we went with the JP, and we do for the 2020 complete rifle, we go with the JP capture spring system for lots of reasons. It's a self-contained unit, but what it also is can be rifle or carbine length. So it's actually designed to be carbine length with little polymer inserts or phenol inserts. So it's carbine length, and it actually achieves, pretty much in my opinion, the same thing, if not better, than the A5. So if that's something you're looking for in terms of recoil mitigation and you're building your own, I would still look at the JP capture spring system.
And I know someone will bring it up, well, why not make it space for the A5 and put a spacer in there, the separate plug that comes with it?
That's right.
Well, we'd have to do significant testing, prove out that it worked. We'd have to make a separate mold for the plug that would go in there to fill in that difference of space between the carbine and the A5. And if you use this with a carbine buffer, if it had an A5 tube length, a carbine buffer without the spacer in it, the bolt and buffer would over travel and cause damage to the receiver. So just giving people the possibility of damaging in that way, I don't think is a good idea.
Makes sense.
John W. says, are there any special chemical incompatibilities we should know about? Spray paint, acetone, gum scrubber, etc. Any special care required to keep it oiled or?
Glass-filled nylon is very resistant to solvents and oils and fluorocarbons, so you don't really have to worry about it in that regard. I think the thing that most people would want to do to it that could potentially cause problems is Cerakoting it at high temperatures. So if you're going to Cerakote it, it needs to be done at a low temperature, longer cure time, with an upper receiver in place to hold the pin locations true. And you can always go to We Plead the Second. Our friends over there do Cerakoting, and they know how to do these properly without causing warpage to your receiver.
One, that's really interesting. You could Cerakote polymer all.
I'm really impressed that's even possible. Yeah, I would not have expected that.
But what if I was using my KP15 lower or what would Stoner do carbine for combat on Venus with sulfuric acid rain?
I think you're going to have bigger problems than if your rifle is holding up, but we'll wait for the Space Force bid package on that to see what their requirements are.
The problem is the acid will melt the wheelbarrow, so you can't do an acid test.
Well, that's true. But I guess in an environment where you will melt, the gun might melt too.
So Andy W. wants to know, what is the expected longevity of the tooling and molds?
Hundreds of thousands of parts without significant rework or repair.
Cool.
So you don't just make a mold out of like red clay and then shatter it every time and then take the one receiver out?
Our cores and cavities for this mold are steel. Glass-filled nylon is an abrasive material, and you know the edges and the gate will tend to erode, but those are things that can be repaired and fixed over time. If we get to the point where the mold is worn out, we will be more than capable of funding another one and a newer, more updated design by that point because of the number of parts sold.
Okay, sweet. Anthony O. Polymer frame handguns have been the way of the future since service handguns, since Glock proved the validity of the concept in the early 80s. With the notable exception of the G36, it seems that rifles haven't enjoyed a similar incorporation of polymer as a structural material. Do you think the KP15 could help legitimize polymer in rifle construction?
I think there are a couple other good examples, like the AUG is not just polymer buttstock and grips, it's got a polymer fire control group to it.
It does.
And the FN SCAR has a polymer fire control module. The CZ Bren has a polymer fire control module. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that have modern polymer fire control modules. The G36 is the only one that I know of that incorporates a polymer upper, though, with any degree of success. And I think we're at the best point in commercial history for the polymer lower to gain acceptance, because we've had basically 40 years of acceptance of polymer frame handguns, particularly over the past 2 decades. And, you know, things kind of go in a progression, right? You know, as Glocks became popular, initially people that were used to steel handguns weren't comfortable with them. And then over time, the current generation of prolific shooters is very comfortable with polymer frame handguns. Everybody's making a polymer frame handgun. So with that in mind, I think we're at the best point in commercial market history for the polymer receiver, designed from the ground up to be such to gain acceptance. A complete polymer rifle, though, I don't think we're quite there yet, at least commercially, because the AR-15 system doesn't lend itself well to the upper being made out of polymer, at least for actual rifle cartridges.
I would say the DI system, right? Because you're moving heat from here up to here, which is exactly where you're going to have your locking surfaces, etc. And if this is polymer, it's going to affect it in a way that's different than, like, say, the G36, which is a piston gun, which the heat stays up near the front, or mostly up near the front. So
and there's like no heat transfer between the upper and the lower.
Yep.
So we don't worry about that. But you know, the chamber, barrel extension, barrel nut area, there's a lot of heat transfer there, and that could become a problem spot on a polymer AR upper.
And I would also say, again, I'm repeating myself, but this is not the same polymer AR-15 lower that you've dealt with in the past that didn't work because it wasn't made to be polymer. So that may help in legitimizing as well.
Yeah. Tim K says, were any carbon fiber or other composite barrels considered to further reduce the weight?
For you guys.
That's true.
It's more your bag than mine even, but...
No, they were not. Armalite had a number of experiments with composite barrels early in their history. The very first Armalite, the Parasniper, bolt-action rifle, it weighed like 4 pounds or something.
Sure.
A really lightweight rifle, and part of that was the use of a composite barrel. They found that it tended to lose accuracy when it warmed up because the multiple different elements expanded under heat at different rates. Then, of course, was the famous catastrophic failure of an AR-10 with a composite barrel during military testing. Today, I suspect we've gotten past those issues, but composite barrels tremendously increase the cost of that component without doing a ton to reduce the weight below what we have with a pencil barrel. So our whole plan with what would Stoner do was a balance. Everything is compromised. What we wanted to do was focus on reduced weight without overly compromising reliability and functionality.
They were lighter, but not lighter enough.
Exactly.
And the lighter enough that they were induced, who knows yet, because that is still really super leaning into the future with that kind of a barrel. And the cost is just exorbitant.
And we got questions about other components, like why not a polymer upper, which we just talked about. Why not a reduced weight bolt carrier? And there are reliability reasons that we didn't want to push down that road. So no, we stuck with good, well-proven, and cost-efficient technology in the form of a standard steel barrel.
Fair enough. Dan E. Has there been any consideration of carbon fiber or other binding material as a substitute for the usual glass fiber as reinforcement in the polymer mix? If so, have you found any significant advantages or disadvantages to the materials compared to a standard 30% glass fiber / nylon mix?
It's not something we even considered. Glass-filled nylon is such a known quantity in the firearms industry for major firearms components that trying something radically different means that you're starting even like at a lower point from scratch. You're proving out the material technology for that application, not just the design. So it's not an area where we'd want to reinvent the wheel to gain what percentage of advantage, and the material itself is potentially more expensive too. And I don't even know that the molding process would really lend itself well to other materials. Like one of the biggest things that we had to deal with the mold flow analysis was, and we talked about it in the other video, is how all the fibers move through the mold under pressure and heat to come together and knit together and form a solid part. So I don't even know there would be data for mold flow analysis for some other materials like that.
Step one, develop a brand new mold flow algorithm.
Ah, good point. That alone right there.
To work with shredded duct tape.
Yep. Or cheese.
Yeah. You're up.
Dennis S. Will Sig Sauer AR adapter parts work with the KP15 lower? I'm not sure what you're talking about there. This will work with any AR-15 upper assembly.
Yeah, so if you want to put like an MCX upper on it, it should theoretically work.
Okay.
Unless there's some dimensional difference there that I'm unaware of. I know they were selling MCX uppers to go on, regular AR lowers, just like the BRN 180 upper can go on any AR lower. So, in that regard, it would work. The other common thing I'm thinking of with Sig is a lot of those Picatinny rail buttstock adapter things.
That ain't gonna work.
But no, that isn't gonna fit because the buttstock's integral to it. So, hopefully that answers this question.
Will asks, will all mags be compatible or will it only run pmags?
It will work with all commonly available magazines. Something people really don't want to talk about with pmags is pmags are larger in certain areas than USGI and they are smaller in certain areas than USGI. So
wait, they're not mil-spec?
They are now.
They are now. They are now as adopted. But the industry is always playing catch-up to Magpul. When the Gen 3 PMags came out, a number of manufacturers had to alter their designs to make it compatible with those magazines. Because Magpul is seen as the de facto standard for AR-15 magazines now. So part of that is the follower itself is shorter front to back than a USGI follower, because the body of the magazine is as thick as it can potentially be. So part of our design process with this was making sure that the bolt catch was located far enough forward to be compatible with PMag followers. Now, if a new generation of magazine comes out in the future, I can't say for that, but certainly the commonly available stuff like USGIs, Lancers, and PMags should all be compatible.
D60s?
Yes, our flared magwell design is derived from the KE Arms flared magwell design. That we updated several years ago to make it compatible with D60s and Surefire 60 rounders. So,
And 100 rounders. right?
Yes, and 100 rounders. So unless you're using some new weird quad stack or drum thing that we're not aware of,
so I have a one-off prototype Set-Me-L magazine. You'll guarantee that it works, right?
no idea. So
If you bought 80 mags from whizbangcorp.ru, who knows? But the reality is
They were so cheap I had to.
they were amazing, right? But the reality is all the standard mags will work.
right.
Okay. Go for it.
As someone who works in manufacturing, I'm curious as to the legal status of the mold for the lower. I know you have to have a license to manufacture the lower, but at what point is that license required? At the mold maker level, at the times the halves are injected molded, at the times they're welded together? How does that work?
So the mold maker, the person making the tooling to produce the receivers, doesn't need a license. It'd be like having, if you simply owned a CNC, having to have a FFL license for owning something that's capable of making something. But the mold shop that runs the mold does need to be licensed. So any part of the manufacturing process, molding the parts, welding the parts, trimming, and doing secondary drilling operations for detent holes, is all done at FFL licensed locations.
Okay.
Cool. James B. Will the two halves of the lower be friction welded together, and is that stronger than casting the whole lower as one piece?
They're linear vibration welded together, which essentially what happens is the two halves are vibrated at a high frequency back and forth, and they melt and fuse together, and the glass fibers knit together as part of that process too.
Nice.
Now, theoretically, you could do a mold that molded this in one piece or closer to one piece, but the cost of the mold and the complexity of the mold would go up exponentially. Doing this as a straight open closed mold where it's a big waffle iron, essentially, if you can view it from that perspective, makes the mold design and the parts much simpler. Doing it all in one piece would require multiple pneumatic cores and cavities to come in from angles and come together in sequence. So like, for example, if you're forming the buffer tube, this would have to come in through here, then something else would have to come down through that, and then if those features of the mold didn't fire in sequence, you crash the mold, you mess up your tool, and it's also, in addition to being more expensive, it's going to be much more complex to run. So you could do it theoretically, but it's effectively cost prohibitive and from a manufacturing standpoint, less desirable.
Philip W. says, will the KE lower be compatible with trigger or hammer anti-rotation kit pins? Pin kits.
It will not be compatible with like the K&S anti-rotation pins because of the arms that come up the sides. The hammer pin area of the KP15 is wider. Now, you don't need a wider hammer pin. K-Arms makes one, and it's coming standard in all complete receivers and rifles and in KP15 parts kits. You can use a standard hammer pin. If you're going to use mil-spec fire control, I don't know why anti-rotation would really be necessary in this receiver. The plastic doesn't really wear the same way that aluminum does with steel on aluminum. It kind of just rotates in the hole. If you're using a match trigger, I strongly recommend you use our DMR trigger or one of our SLT triggers because the retention system for the pins in that is a D-clip built into the bushing that holds all the components of the cassette in place. So you don't need external screws or anti-rotation or clips of any kind for those to work. If you're going to use something else, I can't guarantee without personally testing them all that every two-stage or single-stage trigger on the market is going to work because of the potential flex of the plastic. Cassette-style triggers work best in the polymer lower, and the way ours install make them the best suited for this. If you want to try out other single-stage or two-stage triggers in this, be my guest, but until I personally verify them, I'm not going to guarantee how well they work.
There's just too much variability in the
Yeah,
market.
mil-spec triggers have a lot of overlap on engagement surfaces. The cassette-style triggers all those components are held relative to each other by the nature of being a cassette. If you have your two-stage trigger or single-stage trigger with minimal engagement surfaces and you put it in this and you pull really hard on the trigger or something makes it kind of flex apart because of the plastic, it may not reset as it's supposed to.
Glavos. During development, what processes did you use for the 3D printed prototypes, and were there any serious issues encountered?
The 3D printed prototypes really weren't even necessary from a development standpoint. Well, the reason we did them at all was so people could handle and touch things at SHOT Show before our mold was completed.
That's because you were
And
working
that's
off the CAD diagrams of your original aluminum lowers to start off as your process.
Right.
To then move it to being a polymer design.
Right, and there was some shrink in the 3D printed material that made everything come together tighter than it would in the final molded part. And there was a lot of gluing, fitting, sanding, Bondo to put these things together to the point that people could actually hold and handle them at SHOT Show. And I think like most people didn't even really didn't notice that that's what they were.
Yeah, kind of the nature of molded products is that 3D printing isn't necessarily that much of a helpful tool. 3D printing is nice when you're mocking up parts made using traditional machining, where you're cutting metal away from things, and you can try different configurations. But what you're getting here is you're designing the opposite image of your part that you then squirt plastic into, and there really isn't a good place for 3D printing in that process. So
That said, when this project gets off the ground, is actually out there, and we have live lowers. This is a 3D printed one for SHOT Show, and I've convinced both these guys that we're going to fire this in a gender reveal type party without a brush fire, and we're going to find out how many rounds this can go with this 3D printed thingy before it kind of gives up the ghost. And I think that's a really interesting experiment.
sure, I mean, it's not like it was designed to be fired.
No,
So why not?
But out of the curiosity, like, what happens? We'll find out.
Let's see. Mark asks, will the lower be strong enough to support big bore calibers like 450 Bushmaster?
Yes, with the caveat that you use an appropriate buffer weight and spring. If you're feeling it, like the recoil's harsh, you need to use a heavier buffer and spring. I would personally start with like the heaviest one you have, and if it cycles, great. If it's not cycling or it's not locking back, then go to something lighter.
You want the heaviest spring and buffer for, even with 5.56 for that matter, for it to not bottom out, but just enough that it cycles and will lock back on an empty mag.
And we're not going to test 1,000 rounds of 450 Bushmaster or 1,000 rounds of 50 Beowulf. These kind of questions come up frequently, and it's honestly, it's outside the scope of any testing we're going to do.
All three of you out there that are going to try that, make sure you just get the right buffer and spring and you'll be okay.
Definitely no 25mm Bushmaster.
No, none of that. So these are both full auto questions. I'm just going to ask them together. Eric L. I'm an SOT, and by the way, that's a manufacturer that's allowed to make full auto stuff for his own use. I'm an SOT and planning and modifying a WWSD to full auto. Would drilling or modifying the lower bring up any strength concerns as far as you're aware? And Amanda H. asks, assuming the lawful possession of an RDIS, will there be enough space in the fire control pocket to fit the RDS? Can the receiver handle full auto fire?
The receiver can definitely handle full auto fire. KE Arms is an 07 SOT as well, so we will of course be making machine guns for product testing and law enforcement demonstration purposes. So I don't have any doubts about that holding up. That said though, once you convert one of these receivers to a NFA firearm, you are the manufacturer, and our ability to service and repair it is severely limited. Basically all we could do is replace it with a Title I non-NFA receiver should something happen to it or it was damaged. So if you are going to do that, test it for a few hundred rounds with a regular Title I configuration, whether you're doing it as a machine gun or you're doing it as a short-barreled rifle. Make sure that you have it proofed out before you marry the thing by filing that Form 1 or Form 2 on it.
Don't get an NFA stamp until you're happy with the lower, because then you've got a serial number thingy jig that doesn't work.
That'll guarantee you get the one that comes out of KE that has a defect.
Yeah, that's just how that works.
As far as the drop-in autos here, I honestly don't know. I haven't played with any of those in almost 20 years, so I don't really know how they fit in there. I do know that if you have to modify the lower, last I heard it's potentially a problem if you have to modify a lower to make the RDIS fit in there, because then ATF's considering that you modified the receiver. Now that may have changed because it's been a long time since I've looked into anything like that, but obviously like you're going to have to test fit, and I mean, as you know, RDISs are so all over the place as far as construction and how they were made and who whittled one out, that like I can't guarantee that what you have is going to fit in there.
That makes logical consistency whether you agree with it or not, because if you have to modify the lower, it's no longer dropping, is it?
Right.
Yeah.
Matthew says, do you think there's any way a polymer AR lower could accept standard aftermarket AR stocks and pistol grips while maintaining structural integrity? I think I can answer that one. The answer is no. The whole point of this is to have the structural integrity of having all the parts built in. And if you want standard interchangeable AR grips and stocks, you should get a standard aluminum lower.
I think that's fair.
James H. says, besides increased durability, what other reasons do I have for buying a KP15 over other current polymer lowers, sir?
Well, I would look at all the value-added features that come with it. You have a flared magwell that if you bought a billet receiver, coming with that feature would be $200 to $250, and it's coming in a stripped receiver that retails at around $100. You have a winter trigger guard. You have a molded-in grip that if you were buying a similar grip on the market would be $20 to $25. You have
it's a good modern grip design too.
Yeah. Buttstock with the ability to attach QD sockets or M-lock accessories to it, molded in, and the buffer tube molded in as well. So if you add up all these features combined with an aluminum lower or even a polymer lower, you add up all that stuff that you have to buy as separate components, you're well over that $100 MSRP of the KP15.
You're also buying a polymer lower that was designed to be polymer, which is a huge, important part of that. Fred B., since it is polymer, can it take a stipple job like pistols do?
Yes, you can certainly stipple it and Dremel on it, take care not to go too deep. It is also possible to laser engrave it, but if you're going to do that, make sure that your hood venting on your laser engraver is in place and working, because you will fill up a room full of smoke when you start laser engraving plastic.
KP15 smoke, don't inhale that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fulteroy says, which areas of the lower are most challenging to design for in polymer?
The most challenging part was the bolt catch and magazine catch area, because in an aluminum lower, those areas are so thin to begin with. When you start having to design around the limited space available, plus needing to do negative drafting so that the part can actually come out of the mold, you end up with a very thin area. And also given the fact that it has to meet a certain thickness to be able to be welded. Otherwise it can fall off of the other side as it's welded. So that was the most challenging area. That was like the biggest thing I went back and forth with the engineers, the plastics experts, the mold experts, and we're currently, this is one of the things we're going to be testing as we do our first run, is do we need to change that in any way? It's currently in what we call a steel safe strategy, where if we need to remove material from the mold to make the thickness bigger, we can. Doing the reverse is a lot harder. Adding material back to the mold to make the part thinner is much harder than the reverse.
You can just squirt some JB Weld in there?
No. The for understanding, like, this mold is something that's going to weigh almost a ton. It's going into the press that it's going into is capable of shooting at 440 tons of pressure.
Jeez. And
the plastic will be somewhere around 450 to 500 degrees when it's shot into the mold.
The duct tape just keeps falling off.
It's really cool. Jonathan, I've been wanting to build a BRN 180 based rifle or SBR and was considering the KP15 as a contender for the lower. Do you think the lightweight lower would end up giving me a gun that's too front heavy?
That's kind of a question for you. You've had the most experience, I think, with the BRN.
We both have. I like the BRN 180. It's a great upper. It's really cool. It's if you want a piston gun, it's definitely one of the best options on the market. I would say the full-length rifle version of that would be very front-heavy. The piston's way out front. This was designed to be balanced with the lightweight configuration that we put it into for the What Would Stoner Do carbine project. And when you add that rifle-length BRN 180 piston upper, it really becomes very front-heavy. An SBR version or a pistol version would be different. I think that might balance better.
Okay.
But it's still going to be, I think it's awkward. I personally don't mean to discourage anyone. I don't think this is the best lower for a BRN 180 upper.
I have 3 BRN 180 uppers. One of the biggest benefits to me is they have the ability to take side folders. So if you're going to build a BRN 180, I'd say take advantage of the ability to put a side folder on it. I will probably put together a BRN 180 on one of the KP15 lowers. just to do some Instagram and YouTube content with when they're ready and shipping. And ironically, that would be very close. That would be the updated version of what Armalite did in like the early 2000s with their AR-180B had a polymer lower.
That's true.
And a kind of a simplified, updated upper. So, maybe it's something more along the lines of what Mark Westrom would do today if he was making a new AR-180.
WWMWD?
Yeah.
Stanislaw says, is there an option for a straight trigger SLT2? Because, of course, the complete What Would Stoner Do 2020 rifles come with an SLT1, which has a curved trigger, just like that. Can you get it straight trigger?
That's something we need to talk with Brownells about, because it'd be like yet another SKU for them to add. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult when they're inventorying a certain amount of product and one deviation from that makes a whole new SKU they got to carry.
Right.
Ordering lowers from KE Arms, you can select that from a drop-down menu option to select SLT1, SLT2, or DMR. But it's something we need to ask Brownells if they were wanting to carry an additional SKU.
It's a Model T Henry Ford sort of thing. Once you start going into a larger production number for a consistent build, every possible iteration of things that you can provide as a changeable option makes it exponentially more complex.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge. Alex H. Has any consideration been made to make a non-pistol grip version for those of us in restricted states?
So from the start, we tried to incorporate a fin that would be molded in and then machined off as part of our trimming process in the CNCs for restricted state markets. Mold flow analysis revealed that was going to be a big problem. It was going to cause warping. It was going to cause the fibers not to flow properly. So as much as we wanted to do that, to have like the value-added feature of it being band state compliant from the start, it just didn't work from a manufacturing standpoint. So I think the best thing to do there is to do a bolt-on Kydex fin, and our friends at WePlue II that do Kydex work will have easy access to these to mold and make that part available for consumers in band states.
So you not only have restrictions, unfortunately, you also have problems with
physics
and chemistry. But yeah, so the goal was to try to.
Yeah,
it just didn't work out.
Right.
All right.
And our very last question is from Charles C., who says, do you think a What Would Stoner Do rifle, maybe with a few tweaks, would satisfy the rules for CMP service rifle competition? Carl, you shoot service rifle, or did?
I did shoot service rifle extensively for a long time, and it's weird. Their rules are based entirely, almost cosmetic. So, for example, the A2 configuration I use for service rifle competition, which I still have, it looks like a standard M16 A2. It happens to have a free float tube, but you can't tell without looking at it, which is, of course, not a service rifle anymore. And the gun weighs 18 pounds.
Oh, really? 18?
18 pounds. But it looks externally like an M16A2 and therefore conforms to all of service rifle CMP rules as they are. Now, I haven't looked at CMP rules recently, but I'm going to say that it's an unlikely scenario that this gun, even though it looks vaguely like an A1 config, but it's got a flared mag well, it's got some other aesthetic differences. Of course, it would have ambidextrous controls, which would potentially not be in compliance with their rules. The carbon fiber-free flow tube, again, unless the rules have changed dramatically for service rifle, I think you're going to have a real hard fight trying to get them to accept this as a service rifle.
There is a loophole.
Yes.
If we get the Army to adopt it, it then is a service rifle.
That's
they'll
true.
have to accept it.
Yep. So as soon as that happens, which will probably happen, a month or two after we produce?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll still turn into the new service weapon. Yep. At that point, then that changes everything. But up until that happens, I think it's going to be kind of hard to get this pushed through as a service rifle in CMP competition. And honestly, I don't think you'd want to. This thing is designed to be a handy, lightweight carbine that's field. Something you carry more than you shoot frequently. You can shoot it all you want, but the idea of a service weapon, back to the original M16, was this light thing. And a service rifle for competition, once you're in your bondage suit at 18 pounds, is for score at the KD range.
Right.
They're kind of different goals.
Yeah.
Yep. But that said, what's the deal with these? When can you pre-order these now? Again, I think we talked about it at the beginning. Okay.
You can actually go to Brownells' website, brownells.com,
Mm-hmm.
and they are accepting pre-orders already. No down payment. They'll charge you when they get the rifles, when the rifles ship. In fact, it's either complete What Would Stoner Do 2020 rifles or just KP15 lowers. Would that be strip lowers from Brownells or assembled lowers?
They have stripped mil spec that has all mil spec fire control group in it, and then they have the ambi, which includes the SLT, the ambi selector, ambi mag catch. The lower by itself does not include the PDQ lever.
Okay.
The only one that includes the PDQ lever is the complete What Would Stoner Do rifle.
But any one of those items can be pre-ordered without any money down, and the reason for that is to judge market desire.
Right.
On top of that, though, so you can do that today. But what I do want to say is all these questions came from Patreon supporters, and InRange is unique in that it's completely demonetized and has no sponsors and no advertisers. It is truly a viewer-supported project. It's only here, and this project is actually only here because of that. We had no one to be beholden to when we were going through What Would Stoner Do 2017, and we still don't for 2020. Brownells is ultimately putting out what we think is the right option.
We're pretty much telling them what to sell, which is kind of a fun position to be in.
Yep, and the reason we can be in that position is because there's no advertising money controlling this channel. That's because of people like Patreon supporters. If you are one, thank you. If you're not, and consider it, we would hope you could. If you can't, totally understand, to subscribe to one of our multiple channels. You can find them all at InRange.tv. And thanks for watching.